Hi guys, so I had a spare Neo that had a dovetail sensor. So instead of it sitting on the bench, I've decided to use the RX portion of it, of the fly ballast unit, to hook into the GooSky FBL that enables me then to use my Vbar controller to control this helicopter. So in this video I'll talk you through how I did it. If you've got a Duff Neo on the bench that's doing nothing, you can do the same as what I'm doing here. Alternatively, if you're doing it fresh out the box and you want to buy hardware to make your V-Touch work with a GooSky, then you would buy the Vbar RX that's now available on the market, and they do a 7 and a 9 channel from memory. Much of the items I talk about in terms of the Makrocells programming will probably be applicable, so it may be worth having a look at that section in terms of Makrocells programming, just to get some inspiration of how you will do it when you get the RXs. Quick word about the hardware that I'm using. So as you can see, I'm using a Neo. Now I will say I've literally just pulled this off the bench and it is very heavy. So in terms of modification, future modifications, I will be removing this from the case, and I'll either put it back into a standard Vbar plastic case, or alternatively you can go one step further. You can de-pin the all the headers here and then solder on a lead purely onto your auxiliary 1 output on the main PCB, and then just heat shrink it. If you're not confident in doing that, and if you're in the UK, there's a guy called Ian Contessa. Reach out to him on Facebook, or alternatively search Cool Ice on Google. He makes wonderful charge cases, and he's also a dab hand at de-pinning these Vbar units. He can do the actual FBLs, or even better still, if you've got the RX, he can de-pin the RX so that you can make a much tighter and smaller package. As it is, this will not go into the standard GooSky phone case, the transportation case. So I will have to carry this helicopter as is at the moment. So it would pay to make this a bit smaller. In terms of how to wire it in, so you can see I've got a servo lead going out of auxiliary 1, which is then soldered into the GooSky JST adapter. That's available from any retailer that's selling GooSky helicopters. I think you get a pack of 4 or 5 of these leads. So just solder a servo lead into a JST adapter lead, and then that JST adapter lead plugs into the top of the FBL into the Sbus port in. One word of warning, just make sure you check your polarities on this cable. Make sure that they are absolutely spot on. Triple check this. If you get it wrong and you plug it into the unit under power, it will fry the fly ballast unit. So just triple check that, guys. Okay, so now we've got the hardware installed, we're going to move on to the radio. First thing to do is, on the fly ballast unit, you're going to load V-Plane software to the Neo. Reason for this is, if you use the heli software, you're going to get some weird and wonderful outputs on the tail output. So to get around that, we just use V-Plane software. So I've loaded V-Plane software, I've created a new model, and when it comes up, it's create new model. I've just done V-Plane standard, nothing weird and wonderful, and then named the model appropriately, and that's it. Once you've done that, we now need to tell the fly ballast unit that we're going to be transmitting on the Sbus protocol. So to do that, we're going to go to Makrocells, and we're going to go to IO configuration, and we're going to select AUX1 Sbus. Be careful, there's also AUX1 Sbus in blue. We want the one in red. That's Sbus in, that's Sbus out. And in terms of the time frame, I think it defaults to 22. I have flown it on 12. That seems to work okay, but just leave it default if you're at all concerned or not sure what to be doing in terms of that number. It will still work, it'll be fine. Okay, now we're going to configure the channels so that the flight controllers are transmitting on the correct channels that the GooSky fly ballast unit is expecting. So to do that, we're going to go into Edit Makrocells. Now, Vbar state that Sbus protocol transmits from Makrocell 11 onwards. So don't try and put any Makrocells at the top here, it's not going to work. Do them from 11 onwards. So channel 11 or channel 1 on the Sbus is actually the aileron. So to make that work, we go in and we tell it that the cell type is channel, the input signal is the flight controller aileron, and then the rest of it just leave as is. Elevator, same, we change that to, you can see you've got options here. So we change the cell type to channel, we tell it that the input is the flight controller elevator, and we reverse this as well. And then lastly, before we move on to ESC and pitch, we do the tail. So tail is actually on Makrocell 14, which equates to channel 4 on the Sbus. And we select that. And again, we tell it it's cell type channel. The input is flight controller tail. And the rest of it you leave as is. Now, before we move on to the ESC and the pitch, what we then do is we come out of Makrocells, go into flight parameters and go into aileron, and we ensure that the gain is set to 0 across all 3 banks. Do the same with the elevator and do the same with the rudder. The reason for this is we do not want the Neo gyro affecting the signal going to the GooSky controller. When I selected FC aileron and FC elevator, what that allows is then to program in exponential and agility using the menu rather than having to do really complicated and weird and wonderful curves in the Makrocells. So by using FC elevator and FC aileron, you can then exploit the functionality of programming exponential and agility on all 3 axes here. If you're used to using Vbar Heli, you would know that normally your roll rate and your elevator rate are joined by main rotor agility. So you do have to watch out for that when you're, excuse me, when you're programming or tuning your heli, that you adjust your exponentials on both axes. Oh, come out of that, on both axes. What I have found, me personally, is on a GooSky, I've actually found that I run a little bit more aileron agility versus elevator agility, and it just makes it pyro flip a lot nicer actually. So that's actually a bonus to be able to tune those 2 axes independently of each other, but just make sure you turn the gains right off on all of those axes, otherwise you're going to get some really weird and wonderful behavior. Okay, so now moving on to the ESC, we need to program some flat curves for the ESC to work. So I scrolled down to Makrocell 29. You can do it above here. I've just left it at the bottom. All I will say is make sure that you keep these 3 Makrocells together, and we're going to keep them in order. So this represents the head speed output for bank 1, this is the head speed for bank 2, and this is the head speed for bank 3. You can make them all the same output, that's fine, but I have different head speeds, as you can see there. So to do this, we go in, we tell it that the cell type is a curve. Make sure you name all these, just so it's easier for you to reference later. Okay, so throttle curve 1. And you're going to create it as a 2-point curve, and then you'll set the output as you see fit. That's up to you what you do. So I've got it as 50% output. And then copy that and do the same on 30 and 31. So that's now the head speeds created, but they're not going anywhere yet. So now we then move on to governor. So I'm going to select this. So what this is doing is it's saying, okay, I'm going to take these 3 head speeds and I'm going to assign these to a switch. So I've used cell type multiplex. My selector is my bank switch. And what it says is, in the lower position, it's going to be Makrocell 29 as the input. So that's that low head speed of 50. In the center, it's going to take the feed from Makrocells 30, and in the higher position, it's going to take this Makrocells feed from 31. And you can confirm that's working because you'll get an output result. And if I flick my bank switches, that number should
Bank
go
2.
up.
Bank 3.
And there we go.
Bank 1.
Now, at the moment, this is still not outputting to the ESC yet. We'll do that in a bit. So we're still safe. It's not sending any throttle signal out at the moment. So the next thing I want to do is I want to make sure that I've got the ability to have a motor off position as well. So that's what this macro is doing here. So on this macro, if we select that, that is a fixed type cell. You can check that if you want to. You don't need to. Just set that to -120. So that's basically saying when this macro cell is activated, the feed out from it is -120. In other words, no output. We then will combine these two macro cells to enable the motor switch to work as we would expect normally. So if we go into here, so we're using a multiplex. The selector is the motor switch on my left. And what this is saying here is, in the lower two positions, take the feed from Makrocells 37. So Makrocells 37 is that minus number here. In other words, if it's in the lower two positions on the switch, do not put an output. And then on the upper, it says take the feed from Makrocells 39. And that, if you remember rightly, is your 3 head speeds coming in from this macro cell here. Yeah, so back two positions on my motor switch is off, and if I pull it all the way forward, I get a throttle output. So we can actually check that.
Motor on.
So you can now see I've got 50 coming out, and if I do the bank switches,
Bank 2.
goes to 60,
Bank 3.
goes to 75.
Bank 1.
If I flick it back,
Motor off.
goes to motor off. See, it follows that macro there. Okay, so now you've configured the output correctly. We now need to send that to the actual flybarless unit via the correct throttle channel. So if we can then scroll up, so just remember this macro cell number here, which is 38. And channel 3 on the Sbus protocol is the throttle channel. So we go in there, we select that it's a channel, and we tell it the input is Makrocells 38. In other words, it's taking the feed that we've just programmed in terms of head speeds off that macro cell, and that is now the output to the ESC. And you can check that's still working. So if I go motor on, goes to 50.
Bank 2.
Goes to 60.
Bank 3.
Goes to 75.
Bank 1.
You'll notice it's reversed as well on here. I could have reversed one of the macro cells previously.
Timer 1 minute, 30 seconds. Motor idle, motor off.
I could have reversed the macro cell previously, but it's easier just to do it here. The rest of it is standard. And that's the ESC set. Okay, now moving on to pitch curves. So I wanted the ability to program 3 individual pitch curves that I can control by the bank switch. So that again is bank 1, that's bank 2, and that's bank 3. Now I know a lot of people just use a flat line curve and it's the same across all 3 banks. If that is the case, you only need to program 1 curve, and we will not need this macro cell either, to be fair, if you're only using 1 curve. So if we go in, so bank 1, we select that. So again, it is a cell type curve. The input is the collective, as in this stick here. And then you program your curve as you see fit, okay? And you can make it a 3-point, a 7-point. I think it goes up to, let's have a look. Yeah, 7 points. So just gonna make that a 3-point again. There we go. And then you can tailor that as you see fit, okay? And I've done the same for bank 2 and bank 3, or these will be my bank 2 and my bank 3 curves, basically. A bit like we then did with the ESC earlier, we need to essentially bring these in to 1 macro cell so that we can control it via the bank switch. So we go in here, you can see this is a multiplex. We're controlling it by the bank switch, and what it says is when I switches all the way back, take the first feed from the Makrocells. When it's in the middle, take the second curve, and when it's in the third, take the third curve. Now, if you're only using one curve, you do not need this Makrocell at all, okay? Just program one curve here. Once you've done this Makrocell, we then go up, because we're now going to tell that to transmit to the actual unit via the Sbus channel. So the Sbus channel is aux 1 stroke Makrocell 16. So we select that, and again, it's a channel. So for me, I'm using Makrocell 36. That was that last one that joined all three Makrocells together. But if you're only using one curve, all you would need to do is for the input signal, just choose the Makrocell that you've programmed that one pitch curve on, okay? Again, this one is reversed, and you don't need to do anything there. That's the pitch sorted. Okay, so once you've programmed those Makrocells, you've got all of your outputs configured. So you've got your aileron elevator, or fore, aft and left right cyclic configured. You've got your pitch configured, you've got your ESC, and you've got your tail configured. So with the blades off, make sure that everything operates the way you expect it to operate, i.e. the pitch is operating the right way, all of your cyclics are operating the right way. In terms of the tail, you'll need to turn the motor on and probably put the tail blades on, but just make sure you hold the helicopter tight and then operate the tail to ensure that the motor is going the right way and the tail's operating as you'd expect it. You can also ensure that all of your motor run switches and your bank switches are operating as you'd expect as well. So here's my motor on. So
Motor idle,
motor on.
motor on. Bank 2. Bank 3. Timer 2 minutes. Bank 2. Bank 1. Motor idle, motor off.
So there you can see that all the bank switches worked as I expected. It had the 3 different head speeds. If I'd had different pitch curves earlier, I'd also validate that when I'm flicking in between each of the 3 banks, that the pitch curve is doing what I expect it to do as well, in terms of whether it's more or less on each bank, etc, etc. And that's it. That helicopter should now be ready to fly. Oh, one last point. When you're doing the programming, I would recommend that you do it with the fly ballast unit off the helicopter. The reason for this is, when you're doing the programming, just give the fly ballast unit a wiggle occasionally to make sure that the gyros aren't sending a signal to the head and the tail, etc., so that the gyro isn't doing any influencing of the Sbus output to the GooSky fly ballast unit. Okay, so leave it off the heli, give it a wiggle occasionally prior to mounting it. Long as it's not putting any interaction into the head, then you should be good to go. And that's it. And lastly, in terms of tuning, remember you can tune your rotations and your exponentials through your agility on the aileron and on the elevator and on the rudder, but please never ever add any gain into any of these 3 sections. Otherwise, as I say, you'll get some weird and wonderful behavior. That's it. Hope it helps.